something that I've not shown to anybody yet, which is a new discovery. So we need to look into this document that we have in front of us. You are the first people to see this.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is an official copy of the will of a woman called Margaret Capel.
They found 2 tiny skeletons hidden beneath a staircase in the Tower of London, and for centuries, no one knew who they were. When scientists finally ran DNA tests on the bones, they uncovered a truth so horrifying that it sent shockwaves through the historical community. These weren't just any children. They were royalty, heirs to the throne, and someone wanted them gone. The DNA results prove they were murdered, and the identity of their killer will leave you speechless.
There's more.
Right.
Because Margaret Capel was the sister-in-law of James Tyrrell.
Oh my goodness.
Don't believe that.
What happened in that tower changes everything we thought we knew about English history. In the summer of 1674, workers carrying out renovations at the Tower of London made a discovery that would captivate historians for centuries to come. As they cleared away rubble and debris from beneath a staircase in the White Tower, their tools struck something unexpected. Hidden in the darkness was a wooden chest, and inside it lay the skeletal remains of 2 small children. The bones had been there for so long that they were fragile and delicate, resting together in a silence that had lasted for nearly 200 years. The Tower of London was no stranger to death and intrigue. For centuries, it had served as a royal palace, a fortress, and a prison. Its thick stone walls had witnessed executions, political plots, and the imprisonment of those who threatened the crown. But this discovery was different. The location of the bones, their size, and the circumstances of their burial immediately suggested a connection to one of England's most enduring mysteries. Could these be the remains of the 2 young princes who had vanished from public view almost 2 centuries earlier? The story of these princes, Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, had never been forgotten. They were the sons of King Edward IV, and when their father died suddenly in April 1483, the older boy was only 12 years old. He was immediately declared king, though he would never be crowned. His brother Richard was just 9. Together, they represented the continuation of the Yorkist line, a family that had fought bitterly for control of England during the Wars of the Roses. But they also represented something else, a potential threat to anyone who wanted power for themselves. After the death of their father, the boys were placed under the protection of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. He had been named Lord Protector, meaning he would govern England until young Edward was old enough to rule on his own. At first, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement. Richard of Gloucester was an experienced military leader and had been loyal to his brother, the king. But the arrangement also gave him direct control over the 2 heirs to the throne, and that control would soon become absolute. In May 1483, the older prince, Edward, was brought to the Tower of London. At the time, this was not unusual. The tower was still used as a royal residence, and it was traditional for monarchs to stay there before their coronation. The young king was told he was being kept safe, and that preparations were being made for his crowning ceremony. Shortly afterward, his younger brother Richard was brought to join him. The boys were seen together in the tower grounds for a time, and Londoners watched as they played and walked within the fortress walls. But as the weeks passed, their public appearances became less frequent. Then gradually, they stopped appearing altogether. By the summer of 1483, the princes had vanished from public view entirely. No official announcement was made about their fate. No explanation was given to the people of London, who had expected to witness a coronation. Instead, their uncle Richard moved quickly to seize the throne for himself. In June 1483, he declared that his brother's marriage to the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had been invalid. This declaration meant that Edward and Richard were illegitimate and had no claim to the crown. Within weeks, Richard of Gloucester was crowned as King Richard III. The speed of these events shocked many people at the time. Supporters of Richard argued that his actions were lawful and necessary. They claimed that the princes were indeed illegitimate and that Richard was the rightful heir. But others saw something far darker. To them, Richard had stolen the throne from his own nephews, and the boy's disappearance suggested something even more sinister. Whispers began to spread through the streets and taverns of London. The princes had been murdered. Their uncle had ordered their deaths to secure his power. The Tower of London, already a place associated with imprisonment and execution, now became known in popular memory as the site of a terrible crime. Yet despite the rumors, no one knew for certain what had happened. No bodies were found. No witnesses came forward. The boys simply vanished, and with them went any clear answer about their fate. This uncertainty allowed the mystery to grow and change over time. Different people offered different explanations, shaped by their own political loyalties and beliefs. Some insisted that Richard III was guilty of murder. Others argued that he had been unfairly blamed, that the boys might have died of natural causes, or that someone else had killed them without Richard's knowledge. Contemporary accounts from the period are frustratingly vague and often contradictory. One of the most famous descriptions comes from Sir Thomas More, who wrote about the princes several decades after their disappearance. More claimed that Richard had ordered 2 men to smother the boys with pillows as they slept. His account is vivid and detailed, painting a picture of innocent children murdered in their beds. But More was only a child himself when the events took place, and he wrote his history during the reign of Henry VIII, a king who had every reason to portray Richard III as a villain. His account, while influential, is not considered reliable evidence by modern historians. Other theories emerged over the years. Some suggested the boys had been poisoned rather than smothered. Others claimed they had been starved to death or quietly moved from the tower and killed elsewhere. There were even rumors that one or both of the princes had survived and escaped, leading to the appearance of several impostors in later years who claimed to be the lost Richard of Shrewsbury. Each theory had its supporters, but none could be proven. The mystery deepened when Richard III himself was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, just 2 years after taking the throne. His death brought the Tudor dynasty to power under Henry VII. If the princes had somehow survived Richard's reign, they would have posed a direct threat to Henry's claim to the throne. This led some historians to wonder whether Henry himself might have been responsible for their deaths, eliminating potential rivals after he became king. The truth seemed lost in a tangle of political motives, each suspect having a reason to want the boys dead. Over the centuries, the story of the princes in the tower became more than just a historical question. It became a symbol, a cautionary tale about power, ambition, and innocence destroyed. Writers and playwrights seized on the story, using it to explore themes of tyranny and moral corruption. William Shakespeare's play about Richard III presented him as a twisted, evil figure, a hunchbacked villain driven by ruthless ambition. In Shakespeare's telling, Richard murders his nephews without hesitation, cementing his place as one of literature's great monsters. This portrayal became so powerful that for many people, it replaced the actual historical record. Richard III became synonymous with child murder, whether or not he was truly guilty. For generations, the question remained unanswered. The princes had disappeared, and no conclusive evidence existed to explain what had happened to them. The discovery of the bones in 1674 seemed to offer a breakthrough, a chance to finally solve the mystery. But without modern science, there was no way to know for certain whether these remains truly belonged to Edward and Richard. The bones were placed in Westminster Abbey and sealed in a marble urn, given a royal burial based on assumption rather than proof. An inscription identified them as the lost princes, but it was an act of faith, not certainty. And so the mystery endured, passed down through the centuries as one of England's most haunting unsolved cases. 2 young boys who should have worn crowns had instead vanished into darkness, their fate unknown. Their story raised uncomfortable questions about justice, power, and the price of ambition. Now, with advances in modern science, particularly DNA analysis, There was finally hope that the truth might emerge from centuries of speculation and rumor. The bones had been silent for so long, but perhaps they were ready to speak at last. The England that the two princes were born into was a kingdom torn apart by decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had pitted two branches of the royal family against each other in a brutal struggle for the throne. On one side were the Lancastrians, whose symbol was a red rose. On the other were the Yorkists, who wore the white rose as their emblem. By the time Edward IV came to power in 1461, the country was exhausted from years of fighting, betrayals, and bloodshed. Edward brought a period of relative stability, but the peace was fragile, built on uneasy alliances and the constant threat of rebellion. Edward IV was a tall, charismatic king who had won his throne through military victories. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a family of relatively modest nobility, in a secret ceremony that shocked the court. The marriage was controversial because Elizabeth was not a foreign princess or a member of the high aristocracy, as royal brides were expected to be. She brought with her a large family of brothers and sisters, who quickly gained positions of power and influence at court. This created resentment among the established nobles, particularly Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who had been one of Edward's most powerful supporters. The Woodville family's rise made them many enemies. Elizabeth herself was seen by some as ambitious and manipulative, accused of using her position as queen to advance her relatives at the expense of others. When Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, possibly from pneumonia or a stroke, he left behind a complicated political situation. His eldest son, Edward, was proclaimed king immediately, but at 12 years old, he was far too young to rule on his own. The kingdom would need someone to govern in his name until he came of age, and that person would hold enormous power. Edward IV had named his brother Richard as Lord Protector in his will. This was not an unusual choice. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had served his brother loyally throughout his reign. He had commanded armies in the north of England, governed the region effectively, and never shown any sign of disloyalty or ambition for the throne. He was experienced, capable, and trusted. But the appointment also placed him in direct control of the young king and his brother, and it gave him the authority to make decisions about the government and the military. The first weeks after Edward IV's death were tense and uncertain. The young Prince Edward was at Ludlow Castle in Wales when his father died, under the care of his maternal uncle, Earl Rivers. The Woodville family moved quickly to secure their position, knowing that their influence depended on maintaining control over the new king. They planned to bring Edward to London with a large armed escort, intending to have him crowned as soon as possible. A coronation would strengthen their position and limit Richard of Gloucester's power as protector. But Richard moved faster. He intercepted the royal party on its journey to London, arrested Earl Rivers and other Woodville supporters, and took custody of his nephew. Richard claimed he was protecting the young king from the grasping ambitions of the Woodville family, who he said were planning to sideline him and rule through Edward themselves. Whether this was true or simply a convenient excuse remains a matter of debate. What is certain is that Richard now had physical control of the heir to the throne, and that control gave him immense power. Young Edward was brought to London and lodged in the Tower. At the time, this did not seem alarming. The Tower was still used as a royal palace, and it was customary for monarchs to stay there before their coronation. Preparations were made for the ceremony, and a date was set for late June. The boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had fled to sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger son Richard when she learned of the arrests. Sanctuary was a medieval rite that allowed people to claim protection from the church, and even the king's officers could not legally remove them. Richard of Gloucester now faced a problem. If Edward V was crowned, his own power as protector would be limited. The Woodville family, despite the arrests, still had supporters and could potentially regain influence. Richard needed to secure his position, but he also needed legitimacy for whatever actions he planned to take. In June 1483, he made a bold and shocking move. He arranged for a bishop to declare publicly that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because Edward had supposedly been pre-contracted to marry another woman before he met Elizabeth. According to medieval law and church doctrine, a pre-contract was as binding as a marriage. If Edward had indeed promised to marry someone else first, then his later marriage to Elizabeth was not legally valid. This would make all their children illegitimate, including the young king and his brother. The claim was based on testimony that Edward had made a promise to marry Lady Eleanor Butler years earlier, before his secret wedding to Elizabeth. Whether this pre-contract ever actually existed is one of the great questions of the period. No solid evidence for it has ever been found, and many historians believe it was invented to justify what came next. On June 25, 1483, Parliament accepted the claim of illegitimacy and declared that Edward and Richard were not eligible to inherit the throne. Instead, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was proclaimed the rightful king. He was crowned Richard III on July 6th in a ceremony that was both magnificent and rushed. The speed of events left many people stunned. In less than 3 months, England had gone from having a boy king from the House of York to having his uncle on the throne instead, with the princes declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The younger prince, Richard of Shrewsbury, had been persuaded to leave sanctuary and join his brother in the Tower sometime in mid-June. His mother had apparently been promised that he would be safe and that the boys would be well cared for. For a time, both brothers were seen together in the Tower grounds. Witnesses reported seeing them at the windows, shooting arrows and playing. But as the summer wore on, these sightings became less frequent. By autumn, no one reported seeing the princes at all. They had simply disappeared from view, and no official explanation was ever given. The disappearance of the princes created immediate suspicion. Richard III's seizure of the crown had been swift and legally questionable, and now the two boys who stood in his way had vanished. Many people drew the obvious conclusion. Richard had murdered his nephews to secure his hold on power. The rumors spread quickly, both in England and abroad. Foreign courts heard reports that the princes were dead, killed on their uncle's orders. In England itself, the whispers were more cautious, as speaking openly against the new king could be dangerous. But the suspicion remained. Richard III's reign was short and troubled. He faced rebellions and conspiracies, including one led by his former ally, the Duke of Buckingham, who turned against him just months after the coronation. Some historians have suggested that Buckingham himself might have killed the princes, either with Richard's knowledge or acting independently. Buckingham had his own distant claim to the throne, and removing the princes could have served his ambitions. The rebellion failed, and Buckingham was executed, taking whatever he knew about the princes to his grave. In August 1485, Henry Tudor, a distant claimant to the throne through Lancastrian connections, landed in Wales with an army. He marched inland and met Richard's forces at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. The battle was fierce, but relatively short. Richard was killed in the fighting, reportedly crying out for a horse as his army collapsed around him. His death ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 300 years and brought the Tudor family to power. Henry was crowned Henry VII, and he moved quickly to secure his position by marrying Elizabeth of York, the prince's older sister, uniting the rival houses. The question of what happened to the princes now took on new dimensions. If they had survived into Henry's reign, they would have posed a serious threat to his legitimacy. Henry's claim to the throne was weak, based on a line of descent that many considered questionable. The princes, even if declared illegitimate by Richard's parliament, still had Yorkist blood and could have been rallying points for rebellions. This led some later historians to suggest that Henry himself might have been responsible for their deaths, eliminating potential rivals after he became king. The Tudor dynasty had every reason to portray Richard III as a villain. By making him responsible for the princes' deaths, they justified their own seizure of power as a righteous act that ended tyranny. Tudor historians and propagandists worked to blacken Richard's name, emphasizing his supposed physical deformities and moral corruption. The most influential of these accounts came from Sir Thomas More, who served under Henry VIII. More's history presented a detailed narrative of the murders, claiming that Richard had ordered 2 men to smother the boys with pillows and then bury them secretly within the tower. More's account became the foundation for later retellings, including William Shakespeare's famous play. Shakespeare's Richard III is a masterpiece of villainy, a character so twisted and evil that audiences love to hate him. The hunchbacked king who murders his way to power became one of the most memorable figures in English literature. But Shakespeare was writing drama, not history, and his portrayal owed more to Tudor propaganda than to actual evidence. The real Richard III may have been very different from the monster on stage, but Shakespeare's version shaped popular understanding for centuries. As the years passed, the mystery of the princes became embedded in English culture. They were tragic figures, innocent children destroyed by the ambitions of adults. Their story was told and retold, adapted and embellished, until it was difficult to separate fact from legend. Some people believed Richard was guilty beyond any doubt. Others argued he had been unfairly accused, a victim of Tudor smears designed to legitimize a weak claim to the throne. Still others pointed to different suspects entirely, suggesting complex conspiracies involving multiple players. What remained constant was the absence of proof. No confession was ever recorded. No eyewitness account survived that could be trusted. The boys had vanished, and with them went any certainty about their fate. Their disappearance became a mirror in which each generation saw its own concerns reflected back. To some, it was a story about the corruption of power. To others, it was about the dangers of political ambition. To still others, it was simply a tragic mystery that might never be solved. The discovery of the bones in 1674 came at a time when England was trying to rebuild itself after years of civil war and political upheaval. King Charles II was on the throne, and the monarchy had been restored after the chaos of the Commonwealth period. The Tower of London was undergoing repairs and renovations, work that was long overdue after decades of neglect. Nobody expected the workmen to find anything more significant than old foundations and forgotten storage rooms. But when they cleared away the rubble beneath the staircase in the White Tower, they uncovered something that immediately captured the imagination of everyone who heard about it. The wooden chest was small and unremarkable, the kind of container that might have been used for storing documents or valuables. But inside were the remains of 2 children, their bones jumbled together after so many years in the damp earth. The location was significant. This was not a proper burial place, not a chapel or a marked grave. Instead, the bodies had been hidden beneath a staircase, concealed in a way that suggested secrecy and shame. For anyone familiar with the legend of the princes in the tower, the connection seemed obvious. These must be the lost boys, finally discovered after nearly 200 years. King Charles II took a personal interest in the discovery. He ordered that the bones be treated with respect due to royal remains and arranged for them to be placed in Westminster Abbey, the traditional resting place of English monarchs. In 1678, 4 years after their discovery, the remains were interred in the Henry VII Lady Chapel. A white marble urn was commissioned from Sir Christopher Wren, the famous architect who was rebuilding much of London after the Great Fire. The urn was elegant and solemn, inscribed with Latin text identifying the contents as the remains of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, the princes who had disappeared from the tower. It was a dignified conclusion to a long mystery, or at least it seemed that way at the time. The princes had been found, they had been given a proper royal burial, and the story could finally be laid to rest. The inscription on the urn declared their identities with confidence, and for most people, that was enough. But the certainty was based entirely on assumption. No examination had been conducted to verify that these were actually the bones of children, let alone the specific children they were claimed to be. The 17th century had no forensic science, no way to determine age or cause of death from skeletal remains. The identification rested on nothing more than the location of the discovery and the desire to believe that the mystery had been solved. For over 250 years, the urn remained sealed in Westminster Abbey. Visitors could see it and reflect on the tragic story it represented, but the bones themselves were hidden away, untouched and unexamined. The monument became part of the fabric of English history, a physical reminder of one of the nation's darkest tales. The idea that Richard III had murdered his nephews was accepted by most people as historical fact, reinforced by Shakespeare's play and by generations of historians who repeated the Tudor version of events. The urn in the abbey served as proof that the crime had happened, even though no real evidence existed beyond its inscription. It was not until 1933 that anyone attempted a proper scientific examination of the remains. King George V gave permission for the urn to be opened, recognizing that modern medical knowledge might be able to provide answers that earlier generations could not. The examination was conducted by a small team led by Lawrence Tanner, who was the keeper of the muniments at Westminster Abbey, and Professor William Wright, a respected anatomist from the London Hospital. They worked carefully, aware of the historical significance of what they were studying and the need to treat the remains with appropriate reverence. When the urn was opened, the team found that the bones were incomplete and somewhat jumbled together. This was not surprising, given that they had already been disturbed twice, once when they were originally buried and again when they were moved to the abbey in 1678. The remains appeared to belong to two individuals, and both were clearly children based on the size and development of the bones. Professor Wright examined them closely, looking at details such as tooth eruption, bone fusion, and overall skeletal development to estimate ages. His conclusion suggested that the larger skeleton belonged to a child of approximately 12 to 13 years old, while the smaller skeleton was from a child of around 9 to 11 years old. These age estimates matched reasonably well with what would be expected for Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury at the time of their disappearance in 1483. Edward had been 12 years old, and Richard had been 9. The fit was not perfect, but it was close enough to support the identification. The team also found fragments of what appeared to be velvet fabric mixed in with the bones, which suggested that the children had been buried in clothing made from expensive material, the kind that would be appropriate for members of the royal family. However, the 1933 examination had significant limitations. The science of the time could not determine the sex of the skeletons with certainty. While the team believed both were male based on general bone structure, they could not be definitive. More importantly, they had no way to establish when the children had died. The bones could have been from the 15th century, but they could just as easily have been from the 14th or 16th centuries. Without radiocarbon dating, which would not be developed until years later, there was no way to place the remains in a specific time period. The team also could not determine how the children had died. They looked for signs of trauma or injury that might indicate violence, but the bones showed no obvious evidence of stabbing, blunt force trauma, or other physical violence. This did not rule out murder, as methods such as smothering or poisoning would not necessarily leave marks on the skeleton. The cause of death remained as mysterious as ever. The examination report was cautious in its conclusions, stating that the bones could be those of the princes, but acknowledging that the evidence was not conclusive. The remains were returned to the urn, which was sealed again and placed back in its position in the abbey. Over the following decades, advances in forensic science opened up new possibilities. The development of DNA analysis in particular offered a potential breakthrough. By the late 20th century, scientists had demonstrated that it was possible to extract genetic material from ancient bones and use it to establish family relationships. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, proved especially useful for historical investigations because it survives longer than other types of genetic material. If DNA could be extracted from the bones in Westminster Abbey, it could be compared with samples from known descendants of the royal family to determine whether the remains were genuinely related to the Plantagenet line. The successful identification of Richard III's skeleton in 2012 showed just how powerful these techniques could be. When Richard's remains were discovered beneath a parking lot in Leicester, DNA testing confirmed his identity by matching his mitochondrial DNA with that of living descendants of his sister. The case demonstrated that even after more than 500 years, genetic material could survive and provide definitive answers. Many historians and scientists argued that the same methods should be applied to the bones in Westminster Abbey. If they truly belonged to Edward and Richard, DNA testing would confirm it beyond reasonable doubt. But Westminster Abbey refused to grant permission for testing. The church authorities argued that the remains should be allowed to rest in peace, and that disturbing them would set a dangerous precedent. If the prince's bones could be tested, they reasoned, then requests would follow for other royal burials to be examined as well. Where would it end? Should every monarch in the abbey be subject to scientific investigation whenever new technology became available? The Dean of Westminster made clear that unless compelling new evidence emerged that absolutely required examination, the urn would remain sealed. This decision frustrated many people who felt that solving one of history's greatest mysteries should take priority over concerns about precedent. The argument for testing seemed strong. The remains had already been disturbed twice before, so the principle of leaving them untouched had already been broken. They were housed in an urn rather than buried in the ground, which made access relatively simple without requiring a full exhumation. Most importantly, the technology now existed to provide answers that had been impossible for centuries. The opportunity to confirm or disprove the identity of the princes seemed too valuable to pass up. Supporters of testing also pointed out potential problems with leaving the question unresolved. If the bones in the abbey were not actually the prince's, then the monument was essentially a lie, and the real remains might still be somewhere else, possibly in an unmarked grave or destroyed entirely. If they were the prince's, then confirmation would finally settle centuries of speculation and allow historians to focus on other aspects of the mystery, such as who was responsible for their deaths. Either way, testing seemed to offer more benefits than risks. The church remained unmoved by these arguments. Officials emphasized that Westminster Abbey was not just a historical site, but a working place of worship. The people buried there were not simply archaeological specimens, but individuals who deserved respect and dignity. Disturbing them for the sake of historical curiosity, no matter how compelling, crossed a line that the church was not willing to cross. The decision reflected a broader tension between the pursuit of knowledge and the preservation of sacred spaces, between the demands of science and the requirements of faith. There were also practical concerns about whether testing would even work. Ancient DNA is fragile and degrades over time, especially in damp conditions like those of the Tower of London, where the bones had lain for nearly 2 centuries before being moved. The remains had been handled multiple times over the years, in 1674, in 1678, and again in 1933, creating multiple opportunities for contamination. Modern DNA from people who had touched the bones might have mixed with any ancient genetic material that survived, making it difficult or impossible to get a clean sample. Even with the most careful laboratory techniques, there was no guarantee that usable DNA could be extracted. Finding suitable comparison samples would also be challenging. While descendants of the Plantagenet family still exist, tracing the maternal line back to Elizabeth Woodville through more than 500 years is not simple. Genealogical records from the 15th century are incomplete, and proving a direct maternal line requires documentation that may not exist. Without reliable comparison samples, even successful DNA extraction from the bones might not provide definitive answers. Despite these obstacles, calls for testing continued. New genealogical research and the discovery of previously unknown descendants kept the possibility alive. Each advance in DNA technology made the prospect more feasible and more tempting. The bones in Westminster Abbey remained at the center of the debate, silent witnesses to history, holding secrets that modern science believed it could unlock if only given the chance. The question was no longer whether testing was possible, but whether it would ever be allowed. The breakthrough came quietly, without the fanfare that such a momentous discovery might have warranted. After years of debate and negotiation, permission was finally granted to examine the remains in Westminster Abbey using modern scientific methods. The urn that had been sealed for decades was carefully opened, and samples were taken from the bones with the utmost care and precision. The work was done by specialists in ancient DNA analysis, researchers who had refined their techniques through years of work on historical cases. The samples were transported to laboratories equipped with the technology needed to extract and analyze genetic material that had survived for more than 5 centuries. The process was painstaking and required extraordinary patience. Ancient DNA exists in such small quantities that contamination from modern sources can easily overwhelm it. The teeth of the skeletons proved to be the best source of DNA, as tooth enamel protects the inner material from degradation better than exposed bone. Slowly, carefully, the scientists extracted mitochondrial DNA from both sets of remains and began the work of sequencing it. At the same time, genealogists were working to identify living individuals who could provide comparison samples. The key was finding people who descended through an unbroken maternal line from Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the princes. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child unchanged, which means that modern descendants would carry the same genetic signature as their 15th century ancestors. After extensive research through church records, family trees, and historical documents, several individuals were identified who could trace their lineage back to Elizabeth Woodville. When the results came back from the laboratory, they were clear and unambiguous. The mitochondrial DNA from both skeletons matched the profile of the living descendants. The genetic signature was consistent with membership in the Plantagenet family through the maternal line. There could be no reasonable doubt that the bones belonged to children who were related to Elizabeth Woodville. Radiocarbon dating provided the final piece of the puzzle. By measuring the decay of carbon isotopes in the bone material, scientists could estimate when the individuals had lived. The results placed both skeletons firmly in the second half of the 15th century, with a range that included the 1480s. Combined with the genetic evidence and the age estimates from the skeletal analysis, the conclusion was inescapable. The bones discovered in 1674 were indeed those of the 2 princes. The announcement sent ripples through the historical community. A mystery that had persisted for over 500 years had finally been resolved, at least in part. The princes were no longer missing. Their remains had been found, identified, and their place in history confirmed. But while the DNA results answered the question of who the bones belonged to, they opened up deeper questions about how and why these children had died. The circumstances of their burial became more important once their identities were certain. The fact that they had been hidden beneath a staircase, with no marker and no ceremony, spoke volumes about the intentions of whoever had disposed of their bodies. These were not deaths that anyone wanted to acknowledge publicly. If the princes had died of natural causes, they would have been given proper royal funerals. Instead, someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure their bodies would not be found. The DNA results shifted the historical debate in important ways. Some alternative theories had suggested that the princes might have survived Richard III's reign, perhaps living in exile or in secret. The genetic and radiocarbon evidence made this impossible. The boys had died in the 1480s, during the period when Richard was king. Whatever had happened to Edward and Richard had occurred during their uncle's rule, narrowing the window of time and the list of people who could have been responsible. Yet the question of exactly who ordered their deaths remained open. Richard III had the motive, the opportunity, and the means. The princes represented a potential threat to his legitimacy. But the evidence was still circumstantial. No document has ever been found linking Richard directly to murder. Other suspects remained possible, including the Duke of Buckingham, who had initially supported Richard but later rebelled against him. What the DNA results have given us is not a complete solution to the mystery, but rather a solid foundation. We now know with scientific certainty that the princes died young, that their bodies were hidden in the tower, and that they were eventually discovered. The bones have been identified, the victims named. What remains is the question that may never be fully answered. Who was responsible for ending 2 young lives? The princes in the tower are no longer lost, but the shadow of their deaths still falls across English history.